Welcome to the podcast, People More Interesting Than Me. I'm your host, Michael Strumsky. This week, I'm talking to Ericka Welsh. Ericka is a lawyer who has helped with immigration, criminal defense, and eviction cases. She talks about why she chooses such a selfless profession and explains how restorative justice changed her view of being a lawyer. Enjoy. With me today, I have Ericka Welsh. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
Yeah, we finally did it. We finally set up the time.
Lots of text tag.
I just want to let you know I did a very good intro at the beginning of the episode. You're revered and all these good details. But I guess explain to listeners what you're doing currently, and then we're going to work back from the very beginning.
Okay, sure. So I right now am a housing attorney. I work for a nonprofit in Colorado called the Colorado Poverty Law Project. In a nutshell, try to prevent homelessness before it starts. Try to make sure that people have access to housing justice. So most tenants don't have an attorney when they are up against an eviction. So we want to make sure that people have access to legal services if they need it, and even if they can't pay for it. So a lot of eviction defense, working with tenants on pretty much any housing issue they might have. That's kind of our jam over here at CPLP.
Okay. And I know we talked about this before, but I don't think I ever asked you, when do you think you actually wanted to become a lawyer? Because I feel like even when you're in high school and in elementary school, you never hear any kids, and this isn't meant to berate you, but like nobody says they want to be a lawyer. You know what I mean? Like, unless they have like a granddad who watches like Matlock or something like all the time.
Well, I did grow up on Law and Order, as I mentioned in our in the green room, as they call it, on Law and Order. The time I was so young that I didn't understand what death was. So when they would show a deceased person on the screen, my parents just told me he was sleeping, and I believed them. But yeah, to more pointedly answer your question, yeah, I think it was a bit of a slower realization for me. So I will say that I do remember being probably, I don't know, 8 or 9 and seeing A Time to Kill, the movie, not reading the book, though I did read the book later on in life. But seeing Matthew McConaughey give that closing argument and yeah, you can't not feel something when you see something like that.
What do you mean specifically, Matthew McConaughey or his speech?
How do you? I guess I'd have to say both. But yeah, I think I certainly had this. You know, I guess most kids from a young age have this. As soon as you develop a sense of justice and rightness, you know, there's certainly that in the background. But yeah, no, I was not, as you said, in high school, I was not a particularly ambitious person. I don't know that I really knew what I wanted to do. And even throughout college, I didn't really have an inkling that I would be an attorney. Yeah, there were a couple moments, I think. I remember in particular when I was a senior in college, I was in like a senior seminar class, one of those small classes where you sit in a circle and you really get deep. And I remember my professor, I'm not even quite sure what the subject of the class was. I think it was leadership and meaning and things like that. And I do remember him saying to us, you know, you're going to hear a lot of people tell you to do what makes you happy and to use that as your guide and to follow that. But I think that you should pay attention not to what makes you happy, but to what makes you angry. And pay attention to that and see where that leads you. And I think, you know, I would agree with that still today. I would maybe disagree with parts of it, but that certainly led me on this path, I think, and as it does, I think, for a lot of attorneys, is you know, tuning in to things in the world that seem wrong and unfair, and you want to do something about it. And the legal system, for better or for worse, is just the mechanism that we have in a lot of ways to redress those things. So I think that certainly was a push in that direction. But it was a super circuitous route for me. I so I thought senior year of college, I would, apply, and I got everything ready to go. And then I realized that I had, that I had been a student since I was 4 years old, and I hadn't not been a student, and I didn't know who I was as just a person. And so I should probably just take a beat and be a person, not a student for a time. So I ended up actually deferring all of that for a year, and taking some time to do something else.
No, that makes sense. So I guess I know you waited a little while to take the bar. Was that before or after when you went to India?
So yeah, so I took the bar right after law school. Yeah, in terms of the timing of all that. So I actually went to India twice. And you're right, it was kind of my first sort of legal internship. All first year law students, or most of them, will do an internship after their first year, during their first summer. So yeah, so that was the first time that I went to India. So that was in 2015, after I finished my first year. And I was working for an organization called the Council to Secure Justice. Mm-hmm. It's basically a team of social workers and lawyers who work mainly with kids who've been victims of child sexual abuse, and kind of on the social work side, helping them and their families navigate that. And then also on the victim advocacy side, helping them through the court process. So I basically worked, my first summer internship for them, kind of analyzing court cases, reading a lot of opinions, mainly because they have a very high acquittal rate. That's lawyer speak for people don't get convicted. And so we're trying to figure out why that is. And so I was kind of doing a lot of analysis of opinions and things like that. And so that was my first summer. And then I went back after law school when I reconnected with my boss, who said, we've been working within the criminal justice system, for several years now, and we're kind of interested in making a pivot. And he told me about this new project that they were starting on restorative justice. I had no idea what that was at the time. But that was, kind of talking about pivotal moments. That was a pretty pivotal moment for me when I went back to India, and kind of saw this organization really shift the paradigm and their perspective on what justice was. And I can continue on about this for a long time. But
well, 2 questions I have before I forget them.
Yeah.
What made you pick India?
So I went to Pepperdine for law school, and part of the reason I was attracted to that school is because they have a global justice program where they allow first year law students to go and do human rights work internationally. And so they have a lot of partnerships where, students can go and help out. And so the founder of Council of Secure Justice was a Pepperdine alum, John Derby. And so he kind of always had, an open invitation for Pepperdine law students to come and work there. So I knew that I wanted to work in a nonprofit. I wanted to work in that space and see what it was like. And so it seemed like a good fit.
Did anyone say, like, talking to you in Pepperdine or your family, be like, you're going to India to start? Did anybody say anything to that?
In the way that parents are often the most nervous about their kids going off and doing something like that. My parents have always been very open-minded about those kinds of things. And if they are nervous, they don't really let it show. So I didn't get that so much from them, but yeah, certainly it was not, it was not the most common choice, probably. So there is a lot of human rights work that's going on in that part of the world. But yeah, sure, it was probably threw some people for a loop. But I think on the whole, people were really supportive. I think I ran into that a bit more the next summer when I went to Egypt. I think people have a bit more of an idea of, Egypt being more of a dangerous place to be. I had a wonderful time there. But yeah, certainly ran into that a bit more when I let people know about plans for that summer.
But the funny thing is, you probably, after a couple of these excursions to different countries, you probably got less of that. They're like, oh, she's going somewhere else. It was like, it doesn't matter. We can't tell her any different.
And then my last question on that is, besides the high acquittal rate in India, what's a big contrast you saw with that and the US?
I think just the, probably the most obvious one, the one that comes to mind first, is just a big cultural difference. Especially when you're talking about child abuse and when you're talking about gender-based harm and sexual abuse, different cultures just come at those issues very, very differently. One thing that I realized, especially upon going back and then coming back here, is just that I think we're all sort of dealing with harm in this kind of punitive way, regardless of what culture we're operating in. And so, the responses might be slightly different, but they're all basically telling the same story, which is, if you do something bad, then you're going to have to either pay someone money or go to prison. So I think we're all telling more or less the same story. But yeah, I mean, it certainly looks different depending on where you are. And yeah, as you pointed out, the level at which people can do things with impunity and, corruption in the legal system, for instance, might be different depending on where you are.
We don't get Indian news or some of the other countries where it's like that, and it's like a completely different world.
Yeah, no, I think it's actually, I'm very fortunate that I've been able to travel, but I think if you can, it's, I think travel in general is a wonderful thing for people to be able to do, but I also think, and this maybe sort of sounds perverse in a way, but visiting countries where, you might not necessarily have the same level of rights that you do in the US it's very eye-opening to be able to have that experience and then come back here. And, we certainly have a lot of issues stateside as well, but, being able to see that contrast is not something that everyone gets to experience. And I think it's important.
Okay. So moving on to your time back in the colonies, as they say, I guess that kind of spurred you. You said immigration law, correct? That's what you moved on to after that in the US?
Yes. I'm trying to backtrack to, I had done a lot of refugee and asylum work in law school. And so that kind of translated well to the general immigration space when I got back to the US. So I was sort of in a weird place. Like, as I mentioned before, that second trip to India was really eye-opening for me. I essentially realized that I'd spent, the past 3 years, I'd gone to law school because I really cared about justice, and I sort of realized that I never really thought about what justice was. We sort of, as I mentioned before, we kind of define justice as, paying someone money or, taking away someone's freedom for a certain amount of time. And I had this eye-opening experience where I realized that, we don't actually ask people who've been harmed what justice is. And when we ask them that, we get a lot of different answers. And what if that was the starting point in trying to solve these issues and try to craft our own, quote unquote justice system. So anyway, I had this sort of big, come to Jesus moment, whatever you want to call it, when I was in India the second time. And so I really had no idea what to do with that when I came back. I was very confused. So I, started doing immigration work by day, which was, more in line with the more traditional legal experiences I'd had. And then I thought, I need to dive deeper into this restorative justice idea, this idea of justice looking differently, of it not being punitive, but it, starting with asking the person who was harmed what justice means to them. And I just learned that this is a thing. Like, this is a thing that existed and has existed for a long time, and I had no idea what it was. So I came back to DC. I was doing immigration work as my day job, and then I got involved in kind of the restorative justice movement by night. I met, talking before about meeting someone and kind of changes your trajectory. I met a guy at a conference for this group called the Project for Integrating Spirituality, Law, and Politics. Yeah. And so I ended up meeting a guy who, who said he was talking about restorative justice on a panel. And he said, I'm trying to, start applying these restorative justice principles and practices to the context of gender-based harm. And if anyone's interested in that, let me know. And I thought, oh my God, this is what I was just, what I just learned about in India, and then came back and didn't know what to do with it. So I kind of started partnering with him, kind of shadowing him. I mean, essentially what we started doing was providing the opportunity for people who had been harmed to access the restorative justice process, which can look like a bunch of different things, but basically in the experiences that we've had, like sitting down with the person who caused harm and having a conversation. We call it a restorative dialogue, something like that.
I would imagine that gets pretty emotional, right?
Yeah. It definitely does. Yeah. There's a lot of preparation that goes into it. We, have conversations with the people involved for, months and months sometimes before they're ready to come together. But we want to make sure that people know that that's an option if that's something that they want to pursue, either in conjunction with or as an alternative to the criminal justice process. So I started doing that kind of on the side, along with doing immigration work, kind of as my day job.
That's crazy. So what were your days like then? Because if I'm thinking correctly, what does that even look like at night? Restorative justice. So you were working kind of, I guess, pro bono for a lot of these cases for restorative justice?
Yeah. It's pretty much all pro bono. We're called facilitators. In a lot of contexts, they're paid, but not always. It kind of depends on the program. But me and my co-facilitator, it's fairly informal. We don't have our own sort of organization that I'm affiliated with anyway. So most of the time it's just kind of pro bono and on a volunteer basis.
That's pretty nice. So I guess, how long did that schedule last that you were doing?
So I was, let's see, it was about 2 years, a little over, that I was kind of doing the immigration and then sort of DC-based restorative justice.
And what was a typical weekday for you like then?
Well, I will say one of the great things about the office that I was at, where I was doing immigration work, was that I had a very flexible schedule. Actually would take off Fridays, so I would have them free to do any kind of restorative justice related meetings that we would have. So that was pretty wonderful. I was also taking some classes at the time at Eastern Mennonite University, which is right next to JMU, my alma mater.
I was about to say,
I've
heard of that.
Sort of one of the preeminent restorative justice programs in the country. So I was, really fortunate to be able to just audit some classes there. So I was doing that sometimes in the afternoons. Yeah, we were doing some case prep for, any restorative justice case that we had going on. And then during the day I was at the firm office. We were seeing clients, writing some stuff, reading some stuff.
A little known fact about me is I can remember useless knowledge that won't usually ever help. But Kara mentioned one time that you used to live in London and you would only have a cup of noodle every day because you were trying to stay on budget.
Yeah, London is so expensive.
Like your tendencies and stuff, like it just seems like an endless line of selfless, like where does it come from? Like I said before I started the interview, I know you said earlier why you wanted to become a lawyer, but what do you think working for like civil rights, immigration, such noble causes, where do you pull that from? Were your parents like pushing that? Did you get that from school, friends?
That's interesting. That last part of the question, I hadn't really thought about the role of my home life or school or my friends, the role that played. I'll answer the way I was thinking first, and then maybe I'll get into that second part, because I think that's interesting. The quote that comes to mind, or the idea that comes to mind when I think about this question, is something along the lines of, there's no selfless good deed. And I think the reason I think about that is because I find that working in service of some cause or some mission is incredibly meaningful. And there is my life is so enriched by that. in the same way that it would be enriched by, doing something that paid me, just ungodly amounts of money. Like obviously the ceiling of a salary for an attorney is pretty high, but I derive so much meaning in my life from being able to do work that I can even tangibly see making a difference. And and it sounds so trite, but I think it's because it's so true that I think that's what gives humans meaning. And in fact, just to bring it back to that professor I was talking about earlier in my senior seminar class, he had us read Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He pioneered this branch of psychology called logotherapy, which is about like the role of meaning in like psychological well-being. And it's been a while since I've read this book. Anyway, a big idea in this book is that if you are just pursuing happiness for your own sake, you'll basically never find it. And you only really find true happiness and meaning when you look outside yourself. And I just found that to be really true, I think. And so it reminds me of that quote of the whole, like, no, there's no selfless good deed, because even things that appear from the outside to be so selfless, I think that they provide the doer, so to speak, with so much, and so it feels actually selfish to do this work in that way. But I don't feel as though it's really, even though I might have done work that appears to be really selfless, it feels really selfish in that way. Although, that's dangerous. I mean, if you're doing this work just because it makes you feel good, you're not always going to feel good doing it. And
well, you're basically lying to yourself at that point. I mean, I totally agree with you. I tell Kara this, or I used to tell Kara, and I think she agrees with me as time has gone down. There's no actually selfless deed, and you explained it perfectly on saying that it makes you feel better helping other people because it makes you feel like a better person. It's like you're adding to your. I would think of it as karma.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I could certainly see that, and I think, I mean, I think that just humans in general have this drive to want to be a part of something that's bigger than themselves, and this drive to contribute in some way. And so I think that doing sort of public service work really taps into that part of your humanity, I think. Mm-hmm. And so I consider myself really fortunate to be able to do that kind of work. But yeah, as I was saying, like it can't be all about you feeling good, because you're not always going to feel good doing really any kind of job. Like I just read this book last year called So Good They Can't Ignore You by Cal Newport. He wrote like Deep Work and Digital Minimalist, and
I have Deep Work on my
I
haven't read it yet.
Deep Work is great, but in So Good They Can't Ignore You, I think it's in this one. He basically talks about how it's kind of foolish to follow your passion into work, because so few people are going to be able to find a work that they do and honestly every day, 24/7, feel good and like their passion is being ignited when they're doing it. Like work is just not that way for 99.9%
because it's called work
of people. Exactly, it's called work. Yeah, and so you're just not always going to feel great no matter what you're doing. But I think particularly in public service work can be tough. Like you're a lot of times dealing with folks who are in a big crisis and it's a stressful situation, and like that can be tough. You're not always going to feel good, or you're going to make a mistake and feel bad about that. Like you're just not always going to feel good. So it can't just be about you feeling good, and that's something I would tell sort of a young idealistic lawyer, Ericka, is that, it can't always be about following the passion and feeling good, But anyway, and I do want to make sure that, though, I circle back to the second part of your question, which was like about
your family, you asked me if it was
my parents, my friends, my school. Yeah, which is really interesting because I don't think I give this part of the answer a lot of like lip service when I think about this. But so obviously I know you because I know your wife, Kara, because we went to the same high school, and also elementary and middle school. And we both had a sort of a non-traditional, well, it was very traditional in some ways, but non-traditional in that we had a very religious upbringing and education. And I think, there are a lot of, I think, folks who grow up in that background who develop some emotional baggage as a result, or, maybe have some reasons to knock it for one reason or another. And I think that's completely fair. And I think I have some of that. But I will say that one thing that growing up in that culture sort of instilled in me is this idea of service. And now that I'm talking about it with you, I'm cognizant of it. And I don't think I really have been in the past. But yeah, being a servant, like being like giving of yourself, it was like a very important value in that, in the school that we went to and in that culture that they tried to instill in us. And so I think it would be silly of me to say that had nothing to do with it, because that was obviously a really formative. I was forming, so it was a formative time in my life, going to school and all of that. So yeah, I think that certainly does probably come into play a little bit too.
Yeah, I feel that through being raised Catholic. Like, I feel like my conscience was built into me through that, like Catholic guilt. It's like I don't connect it to that, but it's just in me, if that makes sense. Like it's in my decisions, it's in my, like, I don't think it's necessarily in my thoughts, but it's like, be a good person, golden rule.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that, as much as even might want to, I think, or at least this is my experience, you don't really ever get away from that. Yeah, I don't know. So I was reading a book, Richard Alpert. He wrote a book called Grist for the Mill. And in it, he talks about, he's kind of a big spiritual leader for a lot of people. And he talks about how, we're all sort of headed to the same place, more or less, and we take different paths. And in his, in this scenario, these paths are these different sort of religious frameworks that we use to get to, enlightenment and whatever it is that you want to call it, the universe, God, etc. And he talks about how his path was just sort of decided for him. Like he knew that, like, yes, there are these other paths, but like this one is just mine. Like maybe it was chosen for me, but it's just the one that resonates with me because of probably my upbringing. I think that's what it is for most people, is their upbringing. But yeah, I mean, that's just like, I've just been thinking about that recently. Like, I think a lot of people who have religious upbringings go through a phase where they are like, I want a different path. This one is not working. And more recently, I've sort of come around to this idea of like, okay, this is the framework that works for me, that helps me understand these huge ideas that are almost like beyond comprehension. And so this is just going to be the train maybe that's like most easily accessible for me to get there. Anyway.
It kind of makes me think of, does our brain have an idea of, our collective conscious have an idea of sunk costs, that we've lived so long and all of our experiences, what we've learned, who we know, that we're basically like, I can't give this up. Like if I give this all up, like what was the last 25 years for? Like what was I working for? Like, emotionally, thought process wise, analytically, like do I just give that up to do something completely brand new? And it's like, I feel like everyone gets caught up in sunk costs, and it kind of keeps someone on a linear path where they won't ever change. And I think that's on so many different levels.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. That makes a lot of sense. This idea of, just like doing one thing one way for so long that, why not just continue on that same path? Yeah. And I think where Richard Alpert is getting is sort of like, does the path even matter? Like, does the path matter? Well, I mean, obviously we're talking specifically about like these religious ideas and, how to find peace or whatever you want to call it. But he's sort of like, does the path even matter? Maybe it doesn't so much as where it takes you. Yeah.
So after working in Arlington, Virginia for, I guess, immigration law, what made you switch? I guess, what made you get out?
Oh, so yeah, it was sort of a couple things. I don't know if it was actually all that professionally motivated, but so I think my now fiance, Daryl, we had kind of decided.
I love Daryl.
Yeah, Daryl's the best, for all your listeners out there. He is certainly he is more interesting than me also. So you should have him on the podcast. So we had decided, we were living in DC at the time, and we decided that we wanted a change, and he had wanted to move to Colorado since he was like a teenager. So we just kind of made a clean break and left everything, and then eventually made it to Colorado. And I, somewhere in the meantime, was doing a bit of other contract work, dipped my toe into criminal defense work, post-conviction, which was really fun and new and different. Weird to call it fun.
I was going to comment on that, but I mean, it is fun because if you want to circle back to young Ericka was watching the same thing when she was much younger on Law and Order.
Right. That's right.
She was defending the sleeping people.
The sleeping people, yes. Or the people who put the people to sleep.
Yes, exactly. Actually, that is correct. So currently you're working in Colorado for the Poverty Law Project. So this is a little different angle from immigration. I mean, they're still having people move out of their houses. You're still working on basically keeping people where they want to belong. So do you think this is kind of what you would say your niche is? Like you mentioned criminal justice. What would you like to try out that you haven't tried out in your profession? And when I say profession, I just mean lawyer in general.
Oh, interesting. What would I want to try out?
Like, for example, would you ever go back to DC to kind of push like civil law?
So I like to leave everything open. So I don't think there's anything that I would sit here right now and say I would never do. Yeah, I don't know. I think that I guess so, like in terms of like where I see myself in the future.
Yeah. Do you see this job you have currently as something you'll be there for 10, 20 years, something like that?
I definitely could see that. Yeah, I think one of the really cool things about CPLP is that, so I mean, just for context, like 2 years ago, there were, I think, 3 employees or 4.
Now there's like 15, right? From my account.
That's right. Yeah. So it's really grown. It's in a big growing phase. And it's kind of exciting to be a part of something like that, that's so like in its
heyday.
Yeah, well, hopefully the heyday is the heyday is still to come. But well, I don't know. I mean, our job is to defend people from eviction, so in that way, I kind of hope that we don't have a heyday, so to speak.
But from what I looked at it from the bios of lawyers, you have some big heavy hitters there that are like, what did you say? It's not volunteering, but is it volunteering? Did they say that?
So, well, we do have a big community of pro bono lawyers who are not on staff with CPLP, but we reach out to them to take cases pretty frequently, and they will, attorneys who do any number of different things. I mean, they could be a criminal defense attorney or work in real estate or, do corporate law or anything like that. And they will volunteer on the side for CPLP, which is how I got involved with CPLP, was as a volunteer. So yeah, so we certainly do have a big community pro bono lawyers doing that. But yeah, so I think it's in a really interesting phase right now. It's like a very startup like vibe, which is, I think, really cool to be able to be a part of something that I think is going to be really big in the future. And I also think maybe on kind of like a more zoomed out scale, that I think that legal systems generally are, and maybe this is a bit hopeful sounding for others in the field, but I think that the legal system in general is heading in a really interesting direction. I think that the kinds of things that we were talking about earlier around, shifting the paradigm from punishment to something like restorative justice, to delving into the root causes of why things are going wrong, of why harm is being committed, caring about rehabilitating people who cause harm, putting people who've encountered harm, in the driver's seat of, this machine of justice, I think we're moving in that direction. I am hearing more and more of those conversations. And so I'm really excited to be, to maybe be on the forefront of something like that. I mean, we're having those conversations in the eviction and housing context as well, of like how to do this differently, how to do it better. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't know what that's going to look like in the future, but I'm hopeful. And so I hope that like 5-10 years from now, I'm a part of this big change that I see happening everywhere.
And the funny thing, when you were just explaining that, I was just imagining, I mean, everyone our age, that's kind of where they start to build on the experience. But the funny thing I see with you is I don't see you stopping being on the ground floor. You know what I mean? Like, obviously, you're going to get promoted and stuff like that. But just from this conversation with you and knowing you as a person, I don't think you're ever not going to support the little guy. Pro bono, the girl who's working like nights when she should be probably resting. Yeah, that's what I imagine. You're going to be some successful partner in a firm for some.
Well,
You don't imagine that?
No, I appreciate the kind words. Yeah, no, I certainly hope to live up to that.
I'm not even trying to compliment. Describe someone after near close to the interview. I'm not trying to like make them sound good. It's like who they are. What's that? Frog and the Scorpion story, but not in a negative.
Frog and the Scorpion. I don't know if I know that one.
Scorpion wants to get across the river. The frog says, I'll take you. He says, no, you're a scorpion. You're going to sting me. He's like, why would I do that? Like, we would both die. So frog takes the scorpion over, halfway over to the river. The scorpion stings him, and they both are floating down to the bottom of the river. And the frog says, why did you sting me? And the scorpion says, because I'm a scorpion.
Yeah, now that you say that, that does sound kind of familiar.
But
I don't know that I'm making. Am I the frog or the scorpion?
You're the scorpion. But like I said, not in a negative connotation whatsoever. Yeah.
Yes. I see what you're saying. It's like people, yeah, they have this innate sort of nature. I guess that's an oxymoron, but yeah, I see what you're saying.
It's just like we were talking about. You don't want to get rid of your past, your intellect, your feelings, emotions that you've built so much up of.
Mm-hmm.
We've answered where you think you're going to be. What is something that your parents did that you might do differently with your children?
So something that they did that I might do differently.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just have to say, I just have to brag on Eric and Karita first before I answer this question, because they really were and are such good. They parented me in such a like kind of, I think, unique way. They like, I don't know. I think that when I envision myself being a parent, I envision like saying no a lot. Just out of, and I don't know, you'll have to tell me as a parent if this resonates, but saying no a lot, like out of like almost like reflex, like, oh no, you're a kid, you're a kid, and so you're like automatically probably going to be doing something that's like stupid or dangerous that you shouldn't be doing. So I need to like say no a lot, and I feel like I'm going to do that even if I try not to. And my parents did not do that, or at least that's not my recollection. Not that they let us run wild, and I mean, they managed to. I was a least child, so like it wasn't anything crazy, but they just really let us be us in this. And I have an older sister, so they really just let us be us in this way that I don't know that I don't necessarily see modeled a lot. So I don't know. I hope that I can do that, and I think in terms of like, gosh, I don't know, something that maybe we would do differently. I'm going to take my kids camping. I did not grow up camping.
There you go. I don't think
I camped at all. And and then I found myself, I guess I was 29, car camping for 6, 7, 8 months at a time. And it was, I think it'd be a fun experience to have as a family. And so I want to raise my kids to be little outside children and to just have that experience. I think would be valuable. Who knows? I was a huge germaphobe as a child, so honestly, my parents probably suggested it, and I was like, God, no.
That's funny because when you first started your explanation, I was just like, maybe that's why she went to India and like wants to travel so much, was her fact that their parents never said no.
My sister and I, maybe we were, I don't know. I was certainly a rule follower. I mean, I followed rules for a living, so I was a rule follower as a child. So maybe it was easy for my parents to do that. But yeah, I can understand why different parenting styles exist. Certainly.
Very true. Well, that's it, madam. You did an amazing job.
Thank you much, Michael.
Thank you much. Yes, I think that sounds like something to put on the mug. Thank you much.
Thank you much. Yeah, it was fun.
If you like this week's episode of People More Interesting Than Me, please follow me on Apple Podcasts so you won't miss out on more episodes like these.